Bastogne, Belgium, winter of 1944. The snow never stopped falling, but what truly froze was time. Major Henry Lewis stood alone among the shattered remains of a town once full of life. He had no family left, only silence and smoke. The war had taken everything from him except one final choice. He wasn't looking for comfort, not for love. What he wanted was simple: someone to carry his name. In the ruins of a hospital, among broken walls and forgotten lives, he found her, a young woman with nothing left. And in that moment, he made her an offer, cold, honest, and life-changing. This is the story of that agreement, a promise born in the heart of war, a decision that would echo far beyond the battlefield. Welcome to the channel. If you believe these stories should never be forgotten, join us. Subscribe now and turn on the notifications to help keep every memory and every story alive. Without further delay, let's get straight to the point. The ruins of Caen stretched across the horizon, like open wounds, still aching from the weight of everything they had lost. Fires no longer burned, but their smoke seemed to linger in the cold air, as if refusing to let go of the past. Soldiers moved through the streets with tired eyes, their uniforms dirty, their hearts heavier than the packs on their backs. Amid the rubble, silence wasn't peace. It was what came after everything else had been taken. Major Henry Lewis had seen places like this before, but Caen felt different. The French town carried a sorrow that pressed against his chest with every step. He had been sent to oversee the dismantling of an old supply line, but what he found buried beneath collapsed roofs and crumbling walls was something else entirely, a reminder that not every casualty wore a uniform. In the corner of what used to be a school basement, now turned into a makeshift shelter, he noticed movement, not the hurried motion of soldiers, but something slower, softer. He stepped closer and found her there. She was sitting on the floor, knees drawn up, a torn blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. In her hands, a small notebook rested on her lap. She wasn't reading, she was drawing. Carefully, almost gently, her pencil moved across the page, bringing life to a world that no longer existed outside those sketches. Her name was Leila Dubois, a French nurse. Young, maybe in her mid-20s, with dirt on her face and sadness in her eyes. The kind of sadness that didn't come from a single moment, but from too many days spent surviving one breath at a time. She had lost her parents during the occupation. Since then, she had stayed close to military camps, helping the wounded when she could, trading her knowledge for food, shelter, or whatever people could spare. Henry watched her in silence. It wasn't the drawings that held his attention. It was her hands, steady, strong. She wasn't just trying to survive. She was holding on to something. Dignity, maybe, or hope. When he spoke, his voice was flat, cold, the kind of voice that had forgotten how to carry warmth. "You don't belong here," he said. She looked up, calm but wary. "Where do you think I belong?" He sat across from her, the floor hard beneath him. The war had taken so much from him, stripped him of anything soft or sentimental. What remained was purpose, and now an idea, a practical one. He told her what he wanted, not love, not a relationship, just an agreement. He would offer protection, supplies, and money. In return, she would give him something no mission, no medal ever could, a child, his legacy. The silence that followed was sharp. Leila stared at him as if trying to decide whether to scream, cry, or walk away. "You think you can buy that?" she asked. "No," he answered. "I think I can offer you a way out." Her eyes narrowed. It wasn't the cruelty of the offer that upset her. It was the way it made sense. She had spent too many nights stitching wounds with shaking hands, too many mornings scavenging for food, always one breath away from losing what little she had left. She didn't want to consider it, but she did. That night, she stayed silent. Henry didn't push her. He left her there with the notebook still open on her knees. On the page, a sketch of a house by the sea. Peaceful, impossible. Over the next few days, he returned. Sometimes he brought bandages, sometimes a tin of soup, sometimes just silence. They spoke little, but something shifted. Not trust, something more fragile. A sense of understanding. Layla wasn't weak. She had faced things most couldn't imagine, and Henry, he wasn't just a soldier looking for control. He was a man who had lost the chance to build a life, trying now to leave behind a reason to be remembered. Their story didn't begin with affection. It began with need, with the weight of two people broken in different ways, trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. And somewhere in the cold, grey silence of Caen, the first threads of a strange, unspoken bond began to take shape, not through words, not even through trust, but through survival, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, something human could still grow from the wreckage. The outskirts of Reims were quieter now, but the war still breathed through every checkpoint, every guarded gate, every whispered order passed between soldiers. It was there, just beyond the fortified perimeter of an American base, that Henry and Layla saw each other again. Days had passed since their last meeting in the ruins of Caen. The air here was clearer, the ground less broken, but the heaviness between them hadn't changed. Henry waited in a temporary command office, his jacket neatly buttoned, his expression unreadable. When Layla entered, her steps were cautious, not fearful, just aware that whatever came next would mark a turning point in both their lives. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. On the desk between them lay a folder, thick with official stamps and carefully typed clauses. A contract. It wasn't written in flowery language or wrapped in sentiment. It was clear, direct, clinical. She would receive full protection for the duration of the pregnancy, access to medical support from the best allied staff, a private space within a secure facility, and, once the child was born, a significant sum of money. Enough to start over, enough to finally stop surviving on scraps and charity. Layla listened in silence, her eyes locked on the paper. Every part of her wanted to resist, to push it away, but her thoughts betrayed her. The freezing nights, the hunger that gnawed without pause, the wounds she had bandaged with shaking fingers, too weak to stand but too stubborn to give in. She had made it this far alone. But for how much longer? Her fingers hovered above the pen. She didn't ask about the future, not what would happen to the child, not what would become of her after. Maybe because part of her already knew the answers, or maybe because it was too painful to ask. With a breath held too long, she signed. The ink was barely dry when the door opened behind her. A woman in uniform stepped in, sharp, professional, and composed. Her name was Stephanie Hart. She served as the general's personal secretary, but in this case, her orders came straight from the top. She greeted Layla with a nod, offering no smile, just a quiet kind of respect. "Your transfer is ready," she said simply. "We'll take care of everything." Henry didn't say much as Layla stood. There, eyes met for a brief moment, not cold, not warm, just final. Whatever their story had been before, this was now a new chapter, one written in signatures and silence. Outside, a military jeep waited to take Layla to an Allied medical camp nestled deep in the forest. It was a quiet, protected place, reserved for diplomats' families, high-ranking officials, and now her. There, she would be monitored each day by nurses and doctors who followed orders without asking questions. As the jeep rolled away, Layla held the folder tightly against her chest. She didn't feel peace, she didn't feel safe, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't completely alone. And though the paper she signed felt cold and heavy, somewhere deep inside, a single thought flickered. Maybe this wasn't the end of her story. Maybe it was the beginning of something else. The days at the Allied medical camp passed with a strange stillness, like time had lost its rhythm. The facility was clean, orderly, efficient. Everything the battlefield was not, and yet to Layla it felt like a place where nothing truly lived. She was safe, yes, fed, monitored, treated with clinical precision, but beneath the polished surfaces and quiet hallways she felt a different kind of weight, one that had nothing to do with war. Her room was small, but it had a bed, clean sheets, and a window that looked out onto a line of pine trees standing like soldiers in the distance. Nurses came and went, always polite, never warm. The doctors were professionals, trained to serve, not to speak. They examined her carefully, wrote down results, and moved on. No one asked about her past. No one mentioned the future. The soldiers at the camp barely looked her in the eyes. Some whispered when she passed, unsure of who she was or why she was there. Others avoided her altogether, as if the quiet presence of a civilian in their world of uniforms and rules was too much of a reminder that something didn't belong. And Henry, he visited only when necessary, always standing, never sitting, always with his hands behind his back, like a commander reviewing a report. He asked how she was feeling, whether the doctors were doing their job, whether she needed anything. But his voice never softened, and his eyes never stayed long. When he left, it felt like a door closing behind him, even when it didn't make a sound. Layla learned not to expect more. During the day, she followed the routine. Blood tests, checkups, short walks, along the perimeter. Meals served at exact times. And yet, something within her was quietly shifting. At night, when the camp fell into silence and she lay alone in her narrow bed, she would rest her hands on her belly. The child was still small, but she could feel the first faint stirrings, a flutter like the beat of distant wings. Each time it happened, a warmth would rise in her chest, followed by something unexpected. Peace. She had never wanted this, not like this. But now that life was growing inside her, everything felt different. The coldness of the deal, the weight of the contract, they hadn't gone away, but they no longer defined what was happening. Something deeper had taken root. Henry noticed the change, though he never said it aloud. He would glance through the reports, watch her from afar as she walked slowly through the courtyard, or sat, sketching quietly by the window. She was still part of the plan, still a means to an end. And yet, something had shifted. He found himself pausing outside her room longer than necessary, listening for her voice, wondering what she might be drawing today. And when she laughed softly at something one of the nurses said, he felt it in a place he had long thought buried. He told himself it was nothing, that emotions were distractions. But late at night, when he sat alone in his office, rereading her progress notes without purpose, a single thought refused to leave him. Why did her voice stay with him long after the sound had faded? The morning was colder than usual, the kind of cold that crept into your bones, no matter how many layers you wore. Inside the medical tent, the warmth came not from heaters or blankets, but from something far more unexpected, something neither of them could have prepared for. Henry stood near the entrance, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the ground, as Layla was helped onto the examination cot. He wasn't supposed to be there. Normally, he left these appointments to the doctors. But today, for reasons he hadn't explained even to himself, he stayed. The medic applied the gel and moved the device slowly across her stomach. A soft static filled the air, followed by a rhythm, a small, steady beat. Then another. 2. The medic looked up. "You're carrying twins." The tent fell silent. Henry's eyes lifted to meet the monitor, as if the sound alone had reached into something long sealed inside him. The steady rhythm, fast, pure, undeniable, filled the space like a voice too young to speak but powerful enough to be heard. Layla didn't say anything at first. She just watched him. For the first time since they'd met, his expression cracked. Not much, just enough to show something behind the armor, something real. He didn't speak, didn't move, just listened. And in that silence, she saw what the uniform always hid, a man still learning how to feel again. The medic finished the scan and gave instructions, but the words floated in the air like fog. Neither of them truly heard them. Layla wiped the gel from her skin. Her thoughts caught somewhere between surprise and something softer, something like warmth. Back at the camp, she found him by the tents, inspecting the daily reports. The sun was setting, painting the sky with streaks of gold and gray. She approached him quietly. "Thank you for coming today," she said. He looked up, his face back to its usual composure. He nodded once. "It's the minimum." But she saw it in his eyes. That sound was still playing in his mind. Later, alone in his quarters, Henry poured himself a drink he didn't finish. He sat in the quiet, trying to focus on the map laid out in front of him. But every line, every marking, blurred into the rhythm of those heartbeats. 2 lives, 2 futures. And for the first time since the war began, Henry Lewis felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Not weakness, not fear, but vulnerability, the kind that reminded him he was still human. The days moved slowly, wrapped in a quiet routine that no longer felt as cold. Something had shifted between them, subtle at first, almost unspoken, but it was there. Henry began visiting more often, not with questions or reports, but with small things that didn't come from protocol. One morning, he brought her a new sketchbook, the cover smooth and untouched, as if waiting for something beautiful to fill its pages. Another time, a wool blanket, thicker, softer than the standard issue. Once, a metal cup filled with warm chamomile tea, its steam curling gently in the cold air. He never stayed long, never said why, but each visit left behind a silence that felt less empty. Layla didn't ask for explanations. She wasn't sure if these were offerings of guilt or quiet apologies he didn't know how to put into words. But she began to look at him differently, not as a soldier, not even as the man who had proposed a contract in the middle of a war, but as someone trying, awkwardly, quietly, to find his way back to something human. She watched how he stood at the edge of her space, always a little too formal, always a little too stiff. She noticed how he looked away when her eyes lingered too long, as if afraid she might see too much. And in those moments, she began to sense the weight he carried, the kind no uniform could hide. Henry Lewis wasn't cold by nature. He was cold by survival. The war hadn't just taken people from him. It had taken the parts of himself he no longer trusted to show. But Layla, without even trying, was pulling them back to the surface. One evening, as the sky turned dark and the camp lights dimmed, they found themselves alone outside the medical tent. The stars were sharp and clear above, and for once, the night air didn't bite as hard. Layla sat on a bench wrapped in her blanket, her hands resting on her growing belly. Henry stood beside her, silent. After a while, she looked up. "You can sit, you know." He hesitated, then lowered himself beside her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, almost out of nowhere, he said, "I don't know how to be different." She turned to him slowly. "I wasn't always like this," he added, "but somewhere along the way, I stopped knowing how to be anything else." Layla didn't interrupt. She didn't offer comfort or answers. She simply listened. "I'm trying," he said, his voice low. I just don't know what that looks like anymore." There was nothing dramatic in his words, no grand declaration, but it was the most honest thing he had said since the war began. She looked at him, not as a man in uniform, not as the one who had offered her safety in exchange for a future, but as someone searching for a piece of himself he thought was lost. "I know," she whispered. "I can see that." And under the stars, in the stillness of a world trying to rebuild itself, something gentle passed between them. Not love, not yet, but something real, something that, even in the ruins of war, felt like the beginning of healing. The sky turned red before the sun had a chance to rise. Sirens wailed through the camp as distant booms rumbled closer, shaking the earth beneath every step. Soldiers shouted, rushing to their posts. Orders flew from one tent to another. Evacuate, reinforce, prepare for the worst. Inside the medical tent, Layla doubled over in pain. The contractions had started earlier that morning, but now they came fast, unforgiving. She clutched the sides of the cot, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cold. Nurses scrambled to prepare the space, voices tense, hands steady. Outside, the war pressed in, but inside, something far more urgent had taken over. Henry burst through the tent flap, eyes scanning the chaos, then landing on her. A medic moved to intercept him. "Sir, you need to evacuate. We have protocols." "I'm not leaving her," Henry said, his tone firm, eyes already locked on Layla. The medic hesitated, but Henry stepped forward without waiting for approval. He knelt beside her, one hand on her shoulder, the other gripping hers tightly. Explosions shook the ground. Dust fell from the rafters, but in the heart of that storm, Henry stayed still, anchored to the only moment that mattered. Layla cried out as another wave hit. The pain was sharp, relentless. But through the haze, she saw him. Not the officer, not the contract, just the man holding her hand like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "Breathe with me," he said, voice low but steady. She did. Time blurred, and then a cry, sharp, strong, full of life. The nurses moved quickly. A boy, small, red-faced but healthy. Moments later, another cry followed, softer, a girl, delicate, wide-eyed, blinking into a world still shaking around her. Henry didn't let go. His hand trembled, but his grip didn't loosen. "You were incredible," he said, the words barely a whisper, but more honest than anything he'd ever spoken. Layla turned to him, her body weak, her face pale, but her eyes brighter than ever. She nodded once, too tired to speak, but the look they shared said everything. They watched together as the twins were wrapped in warm cloth, their cries fading into soft coos. The chaos outside hadn't stopped. The war still raged, but inside that tent, the world had shifted. For a moment, there was no fire, no commands, no uniforms, just two children born into silence and struggle, and two people who had found something real in the middle of it all. Henry looked down at them, then back at Layla. For the first time since the war began, he smiled. The spring air carried a quiet stillness, the kind that arrives after too many goodbyes. Months had passed since that chaotic night in the medical tent, and the camp had returned to order. The war was still out there, somewhere beyond the hills, but here, in this small corner of the world, time had softened. Inside the modest room that had become her shelter, Layla folded the last of the baby clothes into a canvas bag. The cribs still held the warmth of the twins' final nap, their soft blankets, carefully arranged, untouched, since she lifted them into her arms earlier that morning. Everything was packed, everything but her heart. Stephanie stood in the doorway, lips pressed tightly together, eyes glassy. She didn't speak. She just stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Layla, holding her close in a silence that said more than any farewell could. It was the kind of embrace that understood what was being left behind. Layla stepped out into the courtyard, sunlight flickering between the trees, bags slung over her shoulder, one child in each arm. Henry was already there, standing just outside the main headquarters, hands tucked into his coat, gaze fixed on her as if trying to memorize every detail. They didn't move for a moment, just watched each other. "You're really going?" he asked finally, his voice quieter than she expected. She took a slow breath. "That's what we agreed on, wasn't it?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded document, the contract that had started it all. Without a word, he tore it once, then again, and let the pieces fall to the ground like leaves caught in the wind. "That paper was never supposed to decide what we are," he said. Layla looked at the torn pages, then at him. For a moment, everything stilled, the noise of the camp, the sound of boots on gravel, even the heartbeat in her chest. She wasn't sure what she had expected. A goodbye, a salute, maybe silence. But not this. Not a man who had once treated her like a plan, now looking at her as if losing her meant losing the one part of himself he had finally found again. She stepped closer, close enough to hear the breath catch in his throat. "This changes things," she said softly. He nodded, but said nothing. Not yet. The jeep waiting at the edge of the camp stood ready, its engine humming low. The moment had come. But neither of them moved. For everything they had been through, contracts, distance, uncertainty, this was the first time they stood not as roles in a plan, but as two people caught between what had been and what might still be. And for a brief, fragile second, the war felt very far away. Layla stood at the edge of the camp, her bag still at her feet, the children cradled in her arms. The jeep waited, engine still running, a silent countdown ticking between heartbeats. But she couldn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on Henry, who now stood just a few steps away, closer than ever, and yet still surrounded by everything they hadn't said. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice fragile in the morning breeze. "Life taught me that promises don't mean anything. People leave, things fall apart, and words, they vanish." Henry didn't answer right away. He looked at her, really looked at her. No more walls, no uniform to hide behind. His eyes, glassy with emotion, carried the weight of everything he had held inside for too long. "You taught me how to feel again," he said, "how to trust. And I don't want to lose that. I can't." The wind tugged gently at her coat, the sound of leaves whispering all around them. The twins stirred in her arms, unaware of the silence stretching between two people who had come so far just to reach this moment. "I love you," she said suddenly, as if the words had forced their way out before she could hold them back. "But I don't know if I can trust what comes next." Henry stepped closer. "Then let's try," he said. "We won't promise the world, just today, and tomorrow, and the day after that. We try again and again until it works." Layla's eyes welled with tears, not from pain, not from fear, but from the quiet possibility that maybe, just maybe, what they had wasn't built on contracts or war or desperation, but on something real, something earned. She nodded slowly, her lips trembling as she gave the answer neither of them had dared to believe could come. Yes. And in that moment there were no ranks, no uniforms, no negotiations, just two people standing in the ruins of what they had survived, choosing each other, not because it was easy, but because it was worth everything they had left to give. The war didn't end with flags or parades. It ended in silence, in a garden overgrown with wildflowers, behind a quiet base that had once echoed with orders and heavy boots. It ended with two people standing side by side, holding hands as the wind carried away the last traces of what they had survived. Henry and Layla were no longer soldier and civilian. They were husband and wife. Their wedding was simple, no grand speeches, no audience beyond a handful of friends and nurses who had watched their story unfold. Stephanie held the twins, her eyes misty but smiling, as if holding part of the future in her arms. The photographs from that day were faded before they were even taken, colors softened by the morning light, expressions marked not by perfect joy, but by quiet triumph, the kind that comes from walking through fire and still choosing to love. In the months that followed, the world tried to stitch itself back together. Cities rose from ashes, trains ran again, letters reached people who had stopped hoping. And in a small cottage surrounded by pine trees, Henry and Layla learned what it meant to raise children in peace. The nights were long, the twins cried often. Henry, once a man of rigid habits and silent pain, learned how to rock a baby to sleep in the early hours. Layla, once a nurse with nowhere to go, filled her sketchbooks with drawings of their new life. Messy, imperfect, beautiful. One morning they sat in the grass watching the twins chase each other across the yard. The world around them had changed, but the laughter of their children cut through every shadow left behind. Henry turned to her and said, "I never thought I'd find peace in the middle of all this." Layla smiled. "And I never thought an American major would change my life." They didn't speak for a while after that. They didn't have to. Their silence was no longer heavy, it was full of everything they had built together, not in spite of the war, but because of what it taught them about love, loss, and starting again. Their story isn't one you'll find in most history books, but maybe it should be. Because it's not just about battles and uniforms, it's about the quiet strength it takes to choose hope after everything's been taken from you, about the courage to love again, even when your heart has been broken by the sound of sirens and distant thunder. Did you already know this story? What would you have done in his place? What other stories about soldiers and veterans should be told? Imagine this final scene. Two parents sitting side by side on a worn blanket, their children running barefoot across a field once scorched by war. The sky is blue, the wind gentle. A man who once lived by orders now lives by laughter. A woman who once survived by stitching wounds now paints her life in color again. If this story moved you, don't let it be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this one, because behind every uniform there's a heart, and every heart carries a story that deserves to be remembered. Until next time, keep these memories alive. We'll see you in the next chapter.